Okay, welcome everybody to the 17th lecture in the Humanities Research Centre's Works That Shape the World public lecture series for 2022. If you've joined us on any of our previous 16 lectures this year, you'll know that this year our focus is on the topic of religion. So let me begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people whose traditional lands the Australian National University is built upon here in Canberra. And welcome our guest speaker, Geraldine Smith from the University of Tasmania. Now, Geraldine has very recently completed her PhD on the multi-faith movement in Australia. So if you can find the applause emoji on the Zoom response, then I think that finishing a PhD definitely deserves an emoji or two. Now, her PhD was part of the Australian Research Council funded project Religious Diversity in Australia, Strategies to Maintain Social Cohesion. And Jerry is now currently involved in several research projects, including a project on religious freedom and LGBT plus discrimination, and also on the International Non-Religion in Complex Futures project. So there genuinely is nobody better than Geraldine Smith of the University of Tasmania to introduce us to the declarations of the multi-faith movement.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Thank you for having me. So yes, I have just recently submitted my PhD, so I'll try not to tell you about the entire PhD in this presentation because we'll be here a while. But I'll just first acknowledge that I'm currently in Hobart. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Muwinina people. And in Hobart, Palawakani, it's Nipaluna. In Tasmania, there's Lutruwita. So there's a few words you can learn there. And as now, when I wrote this acknowledgement of country, I could actually see Mount Langton, which is Kwinani, out the window, but it is so overcast today that I actually can't, but I would see it. So it's a privilege that I'm here on unceded lands talking to you today. So thank you so much for having me. I've got if my email comes up here, just if you have any questions, I will be happy to hear them under the presentation, but also I've got my email there if anyone wanted to email me for more information. But yeah, so I'm going to be giving you a condensed version of my PhD. And as Ibrahim mentioned, it's part of a broader ARC project on religious diversity in Australia. And so just to acknowledge my excellent supervisors, Doug Ezzi and Anna Halifoff, who are also the chief investigators on the project, alongside Greg Barton and the late Gary Baumer. And so I just also acknowledge that a lot of the research, the kind of foundational text that I was working on was Halifoff's book on the multi-faith movement. And she's published a lot of things on this topic and is someone who is deeply embedded in the multi-faith movement, particularly in Victoria. So a lot of this stuff today is the context that I give you is coming from her previous research. And there's a link there if you want to know more about the project. And there also will be a book coming out next year, I think, that will discuss our findings. So just to give you a little context, before I kind of get to the text I want to focus on today. So I did about 25 interviews with people working in multi-faith organisations in Hobart, Sydney and Melbourne. And I also attended into the events that were being put on by these organisations. And it was with the idea that I wanted to understand, like, what is interfaith or multi-faith? So I will use its terms interchangeably. They basically mean the same thing. So interfaith or multi-faith, what does it actually look like in the world? What are people actually doing? And so I went along to these events. I was completely unfamiliar with the world of multi-faith movement. And I found myself in these really interesting scenarios where I was meeting people from different religious backgrounds. I have a background in religious studies, but this was actually the first time that I was going out into the world and meeting this diversity. And the picture on the screen at the moment is taken from one of the events I attended, which was a series of forums put on by the Colombian Center for Christian-Muslim Relations. And they're running an initiative called Youth Power. And this event was probably the most significant in all the events I attended, because it was the first time that I was with people that were my own age. So previously, a lot of the events I attended, I was always the youngest person there. And this will become relevant later as we talk more about where the multi-faith movement is heading. But this was the first time that I was with young people, with people my age, and we're talking about these issues from the perspective of someone, people that were growing up in a diverse society. They were based in Sydney, which is where I'm also from. And the Colombian Centre had a kind of special place for me because it was, they're located in where I grew up in Western Sydney, in Blacktown. And so it was a really important moment when I went to these events and participated in this way. And so the reason I want to kind of flag this kind of generational difference is to kind of talk about how the movement shifts according to the context. So it's very much about, what are the challenges of the time? And it will kind of, there are a few things that continue throughout the movement, the modern multi-faith movement, but there are some things that get emphasized or less emphasized according to what's happening in the world. So it's very much a context-based movement. And my research was very much about how are people negotiating these diverse relationships? How is it performed? Very much, embodiment relationships. So it was less about text, but I will try and talk about it from a, look at it through the text as well, because they are important, and you'll see why, especially at the end. So this is an important document in the interfaith world towards a global ethic and initial declaration. These are the first few lines. So it's quite a long declaration, but it's quite a dramatic, beginning. It's like the world is in agony. The agony is so pervasive and urgent that we are compelled to name its manifestations so that the depth of this pain may be made clear. Peace eludes us. The planet is being destroyed. Neighbors live in fear. Women and men are estranged from each other. Children die. This is abhorrent. So these are the opening words to this statement. And so I'll give you a bit of a context to how we get to this point and why it's relevant that it's got this really urgent and global kind of focus. So just going back to the beginning of the modern multi-faith movement. So obviously throughout history, people from different religious traditions and groups have encountered each other, of course, but this is the first kind of modern manifestation of that. And it's the 1893 First Parliament of the World's Religions, which was part of the World's Columbian Exposition to celebrate the kind of colonial conquest of Columbus. And it was very much an event that was celebrating American Protestant Christianity, kind of uniting all of these religious traditions. And so there was kind of this narrative of Christian dominionism that, finally, all these traditions, all these people are going to realize that actually they're all Christian, or that they're all going to find consummation in the Christian story. And so that's one part of what's happening at this event. But on the other hand, what they probably didn't anticipate is that you have Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish participants come along to this event and participate in doing talks and presentations and speaking with other people. And they actually challenge a lot of the colonial undertones of the event. They kind of dispel misconceptions about their traditions, and they bring to light a lot of the brutalities of colonization. So there's these two things happening. There's this Christian narrative, and then there's also a challenging aspect to that, a critical aspect. So just a side note, when I gave Ibrahim this image to kind of be part of the flyer, he said, oh, you may get questions about what young Rasputin is doing at the parliament. And I went, what? Rasputin? So I looked at it again and I thought, is this Rasputin? Is it? If anyone knows, let me know, and please don't ask me because I don't know. I've not been able to find anything that could tell me whether or not Rasputin is attending this conference. I don't know. Anyway, that's just a side note if anyone knows anything. So at this event, I want to kind of just point to two key figures that are kind of presenting two different ideas of what this event is about and what they've created by bringing all these people together, because they have created something. They've created the first moment of the multi-faith movement. So you've got the chairman of the general committee organizing the event, John Henry Barrows, who's a Presbyterian minister, and he kind of writes, but religion, like the white light of heaven, has been broken into many colored fragments by the prisms of men. One of the objects of the Parliament of Religions has been to change this many colored radiance back into the white light of heavenly truth. So that's kind of the idea that all religions are going to be consummated under Christianity. It's kind of the beginning where all of this diversity will start to melt away and everyone will be kind of become Christians. And, this is the first moment where that's happening. And then compare this to Jenkin Lloyd-Jones, who's a kind of pioneer in Unitarianism. He's a Unitarian minister. He's also part of the committee organizing this event. And he's very critical of this Christian dominionism narrative. And in his closing address, he talks about how the interfaith is the new kind of open temples of reason, holy shrines of helpfulness and confessionals, where the soul will not be afraid to confess its ignorance. So there's something a bit more of a humanist, or I guess maybe secular narrative being told here. And I highlight this because it shows that there's a bit of a tension within the movement that still plays out today between people that may see it as more of a syncretism of all religions. And a lot of people in the movement, they don't like that idea. If you say to them, is interfaith the syncretism of all religion, they'll say, no, that's absolutely not what we're doing. And we don't like that because it scares people off, because they think that their religious difference is going to be taken away from them, or that they're trying to create a new religion. But it is there. There is this kind of undertone that there is something common in all of these traditions. There's something that is underneath all these traditions. Like you get the image of the mountain where it's, that doesn't matter what side you come up the mountain, everyone's heading towards the top. So there's kind of that kind of convergent pluralism, which that's a term that Kate McCarthy uses. And then you've got this idea where it's like, okay, there is commonalities, but interfaith is also about finding ways of dealing with difference, and that it's not about convergence. Not everyone's heading to the same point. Actually, religious traditions are radically different. They're foundationally different, and we don't want to rub out this difference at all. So there's these tensions within the movement that continually play out as it kind of develops from that beginning of the first parliament. So a little historical context of what happens after the parliament. So there isn't a bit of attempt where a few of the first organisations are created, but as Kate Marshall says, interreligious dialogue was a grace note in the era's history, and dueling ideologies seemed far more significant. So it's kind of like the movement gets put on pause for a little while, or the efforts to bring together people are heavily stunted by the world wars. And it's quite ironic. The one of the first, like a significant organization, the Church Peace Union, which is a coalition of Catholic, Protestant, Jewish groups. They all attend this conference in Germany on the day that war is declared. So there's this, it kind of gets crushed under conflict. But because of that, post World War II, there's kind of a guilt or a kind of realization, especially from Christian leaders, that they need to do something about or rectify all that happened with the Holocaust. So you get these Jewish-Christian bilateral relations beginning, and that extends out of Jewish-Christian-Muslim kind of peace building initiatives starting. So it's a bit of a reaction to kind of all the conflict. And then as you're heading towards the latter part of the 20th century, a new vision starts to develop. And it's not that it's a completely new concept, but it becomes more codified. And that's where we start heading towards the declaration towards a global ethic. So just to give a background, so my supervisor, Anna Hallerfoff, in 2013, she publishes the Multifaith Movement, Global Risks and Cosmopolitan Solutions. And her account of what's going on is very much based in cosmopolitanism, which is developing from Ulrich Beck's A Cosmopolitan Vision. So the cosmopolitan vision, it's kind of on the one hand, it's a description of what is happening. So it's a description of the globalization that is experienced in the latter part of the 20th century. It's the realization that there's these social movements that are connecting across national boundaries, that the nation state is no longer kind of the boundary that keeps everyone in. People are able to create connections across the world and have these global movements. But it's also a vision about, what should be. And there's a lot of themes around this realization that the world's problems are incredibly interdependent. So if you think of things like nuclear war, like for that, to avoid nuclear war, it requires a global effort, or climate change, it requires global collaboration. So that's kind of what the cosmopolitan story is trying to get at. And within the interfaith movement, what's happening is that the movement's shifting away from this story about Christian dominionism, and it's starting to focus on this outward picture of global issues. So it develops alongside other social movements like feminist and environmental, the indigenous and civil rights movements. So it's kind of growing up in a similar context, and there's paralleling themes within those movements. And they become really concerned with nuclear war and environmental destruction and poverty, and what's the role of religious actors within the global world is kind of the question. And there's also this acceptance of the diversity of the world, and that part of this multi-faith cosmopolitan vision is respecting diversity. And that extends not just with human life, but also non-human life, or more than human. So it's multi-species diversity and respect for that, and a real environmental awareness and focus on peace building. So as you can see, like the context, the social context is changing the movement. It's emphasizing different things. It's not to say that these ideas weren't present previously, but certain narratives are being spun within these kind of broad themes. Yes. So then we get what people consider the moment that the multi-faith movement comes of age. So it happens 100 years after the first parliament in 1893. They have the second parliament of the world's religions, and it's held in Chicago, in the same place that the first parliament was held. And it ends up leading to an organization being developed, which is now the Parliament of the World's Religions, which you can look up on their website. And at the same time, they produce or they codify towards a global ethic an initial declaration. And it's drafted by Hans Küng, but with collaboration of religious leaders and scholars. And we'll get to the statement in a second, but I just want to point out that the key theme is this global ethic, is this idea that we are now in a global world. Interfaith is responding to a global context. And just to go back to that tension I mentioned before about what is interfaith, what are we actually creating? Is it a syncretism of all religions, or is it the celebration of radical difference? And that is still playing out. So in the top picture, you've got Wayne Teasdale, who considered himself a monk of the world. He was a Catholic monk, and he's got this idea about interspirituality. For him, the interfaith movement is this kind of combining the spiritual wisdom of all traditions. So again, going back to that, going up, everyone's going up the mountain, everyone's going to the same place, the same goal. There's a deeper essence that is within all traditions, that really everything else is just kind of, is just a superficial. There's something deeper that all religions are talking about. And so he talks about interspirituality, as he says, interspirituality and the intermystical life it entails recognizes the larger community of humankind in the mystical quest. It realizes that we all have a much greater heritage than simply our own tradition. So there's something, a mysticism beneath all religions. And Wayne Teasdale, he's not like a marginal figure. I think he was crucial in the development of the Second Parliament, and he's a well-known writer within the interfaith world and probably beyond. So this is a central figure saying these things. And then you compare that to Paul Knitter, who he still has a kind of a bit of a, there's a spiritual essence between traditions, but his approach is more that there's a common context that contains a common complex of problems, and that religions have a global responsibility for human and ecological well-being. So the thing that actually brings religions together within this movement is not necessarily this deeper essence. It's actually the fact that religions are concerned with similar problems. And that's a really key part of the interfaith movement as it develops in the 90s and the 2000s, and probably still today. So this is just another larger section of the declaration. It's much bigger, there's a much bigger document, but this is just kind of the dramatic opening of it. I won't read the whole thing. I'll just flag some of the things that I've put in bold. So there's the environmental aspect. So the planet is being destroyed. We condemn the abuses of the Earth's ecosystem. So there's a big, multi-species diversity. It's not just about human suffering. It's about the suffering of all things, all living things. There's this idea that is also about, economics, poverty, social inequality. And there's this real theme that it's religious figures have an important moral role in, I guess, a secular world or a pluralistic world. They've kind of the moral compass trying to alert the world to these problems. And there's also this idea of truth that's playing out, that they hold a truth that is, special to religious worldviews. And that's an interesting idea, because that starts to fall apart a little bit in the contemporary context where non-religious voices start to participate in multi-faith movement. So the question is, if non-religious worldviews are also relevant for interfaith, is there really anything special about religious perspectives? And I think that's an interesting topic, an interesting conversation. And there's also this respect between gender equality between men and women. And there's also a real strong kind of multicultural aspect to it as well. So that gets codified in the 90s, and there's people like Wayne Teasdale and Paul Nitter writing these things about the global responsibility and the global ethic of the movement. And then we enter into the 2000s, and we have these events. You have 9/11, we have in 2001, the Bali bombings in 2002, London bombings in 2005. So all these events of global terrorism that's connected to religion. And so the narrative is still there. The kind of the multi-faith vision is there, but this kind of fits into it quite well because it's about, the common threat to the living world. And so this kind of narrative of peace also becomes really important. And so for the 2000s in Australia, there's this golden age where multi-faith organisations and initiatives start to get a lot of state funding, especially in Victoria. It doesn't happen as much in other states. Victoria's really becomes the centre for this, state support being put into interfaith. And there was interfaith things going on before, but this really, this is like a burst of all these organisations and these structures being put into place that are still functioning today. Because the idea is that it's part of the kind of counter-terrorism. It becomes brought into a narrative of counter-terrorism and peace building. So you can see how there's still, it's not like a completely new idea that interfaith is about peace building, but that becomes emphasized because of this context. So going back to the idea that it's responding to the context, the social context it's in. And just a little side note, I spoke to several people that are operating in multi-faith organizations in Sydney, and I asked them about, so what was happening in this period? And one person said, well, I happened to organize an open mosque day 9 days before 9/11 happened. So it was really, there was a sense of pride in that he was already putting these initiatives in. So it's just trying to show that there was still things happening. It wasn't because of 9/11 that interfaith came to be. There was still people worried about this, but it just leads to it kind of being accelerated. So just to give you a sense of what these organizations are and what actually gets created out of this entire kind of history of interfaith and parliaments of world religions and all that. So in Victoria, we've got things like the Faith Communities Council of Victoria. They're kind of the peak body. And we've got the Interfaith Network of the City of Greater Dandenong. I did a lot of interviews and field work with the Dandenong Interfaith Network. And there's also Interaction, which doesn't really operate at the moment, but that was a big youth movement, youth interfaith movement that was happening during this kind of golden age. In New South Wales, I mentioned the Columban Centre for Christian Muslim Relations and Youth Power. And there's Religions for Peace, which is operating in New South Wales, but also has a kind of national presence. It's also operating in Tasmania. And there's also these like small dialogue groups that pop up in various places that are usually just a small group of people that come together and they just talk about different kind of spiritual perspectives. So that's just a sense. Oh, and they also got the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, or ARC. I want to point them out because they're quite unique. They join interfaith with environmental activism. So you can kind of see like the different approaches that each organization is taking, and it's still kind of an expression of this global ethic or this global responsibility. And so I want to address the question of, well, how do multi-faith organizations shape the world? Why, what does this actually lead to? This document saying the world is in agony. What does it actually lead to? What does it look like? In doing my PhD, a common issue I had was I would tell people, I'm doing a PhD. Oh, what in? Interfaith or multi-faith? And they go, what's that? And it starts this whole thing of like, well, it's like a social movement. It like kind of does these things. It's kind of hard to pin down because people don't really haven't really come across it unless you're in Victoria. It's kind of this movement that's operating around, and maybe it's like a bit subterranean. I don't know. There's something going on where not many people have heard of interfaith. So I like to try and talk about the things that they do because that helps kind of articulate what they are. So this is just a little list of a few things that I observed when I was doing my field work and interviews of what was going on. You have groups like the Faith Communities Council of Victoria. They're a peak body. They represent the official positions of religious organizations. And they have a big kind of coordinating role for smaller interfaith groups around Victoria. You've got groups that are doing social justice and activism. You've got the environmental activists that are using their kind of shared common context of common problems to tackle climate change. There's a lot of groups like Together for Humanity and Affinity Intercultural Foundation. They're doing educational programs, especially in schools. And what this looks like is they'll have a Jewish person, a Muslim person, a Christian person stand at the front of the classroom and just talk to the students and ask them questions like, who do you think here is Australian? And so trying to get a conversation going about religious difference. And so it's kind of being a voice of demonstrating to other people, this is what respect between religious people looks like. This is how you respectfully engage with someone that's got a completely different worldview to you. How do you talk to them? What do you say? How do you make sure you're addressing them as a full person? A few other examples, Interaction. They did a lot of leadership camps where they were teaching young people how to have these conversations in university spaces. The Jewish Christian Muslim Association, they go on interfaith trips to Jerusalem, which are quite amazing. A lot of these groups do dialogue, which is basically the idea of sitting in a room and talking on spiritual topics with each other and learning how to navigate, okay, here are the commonalities, but here are also the differences. And a lot of what they do is they organize events. And this kind of became the central part of my thesis is, what happens at these events? When one of these organizations puts on a large scale event where they're serving food and they're asking the local communities, the local Muslim community, the local Christian community, the local Baha'i community to come along, how are they facilitating all these different people talking to each other? What's actually happening in the room? So that was kind of my focus. And now I just want to head towards a conclusion, is thinking about the next generation. So throughout this talk, I've mentioned, the way that the interfaith movement or multi-faith movement is always shifting. It's responding to the context, and that was Hallerfoff's idea in her book, is that it's responding with global solutions. It's got that global responsibility. So with the next generation, what's going to happen? just to return to what I said at the beginning as well about going to these youth forums where I was finally with a group of people that were my own age, you know, what kind of vision is going to be articulated? Because you have a large cohort of millennials and Gen Z who are non-religious. You've got a lot of them who are spiritual but don't really identify with any particular religious group. You've got people that are mixing different traditions together. Maybe they've grown up in families where their parent is from one tradition, their parent's from another, and so they're kind of mixing, they're creating these hybrid religious expressions. So what do you do with this new generation? Because the way that people find themselves in a lot of multi-faith organizations is that it's because they're involved in their religious community and someone goes, oh, we need a representative to go to this event to maybe do a talk on, you know, this topic. But if the young people aren't really in those spaces, or they're kind of existing at the margins of religious organizations, there's a bit of a problem. And there is a bit of a crisis of succession happening with interfaith, where you've got all these wonderful people that are in these organizations. They're incredibly passionate, but they are looking for the next generation to mentor, but they're not there. And so Youth Power was a really important example of how to involve young people. And the way they did it is they said anyone can come to these forums, you know, anyone between the ages, I think it was 18 and 35 or something like that. And it doesn't matter what religion you are, it doesn't matter if you're religious, you still have something to offer here. And we came together and we sat on tables together and we had big pieces of paper where we were asked questions about the kind of world we wanted to see in the future. And it didn't matter where you were coming from. And so that's why I think these events were really exemplary of how to engage the next generation of multi-faith leaders. But it is a big question. What is the next generation going to come up with? So the Youth Power Forums, the reason that we came together to have those discussions was to create something called the Sydney Statement, which came out, I think, in 2021. And this statement is kind of the Sydney's version of a multi-faith declaration. And what's significant about it is that you can see that it's trying to talk to not just religious audiences, it's talking to religious, spiritual, non-religious audiences. And it's trying to be inclusive of all of those worldviews. And so I think I'd encourage you to have a look and see the kind of things that they're talking about in it. There's still a lot of the common themes throughout the multi-faith movement that you get towards the Global Ethic Declaration, but it's another articulation for the new generation of potential multi-faith leaders.